I read Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else by Olúfẹ Táíwò. This is nonfiction book that's popular philosophy, basically. Its focus is political philosophy, but its structure is academic with language that is accessible to people who are not in academia. I've read this book before, so it's a reread. An Elite Capture came out a few years ago, so it might not be totally relevant in terms of the particular issues that he's trying to address. But I think the underlying principle of his point makes sense. He's trying to construct a new way to do politics. Well, I say construct. That's like his whole thing is constructivist politics is the philosophy that he's putting forward and that he's trying to contrast with the status quo of political philosophy and how it's not serving us very well if we're interested in sweeping social change. And so while the particulars of that status quo or the things that we're trying to accomplish and the roadblocks in the way might not be fully applicable as time moves on, the idea of constructive politics is still useful. And he cites how prior to his creating this philosophy, there were people in the world who were already doing this. So it's not something that you even need to have a formal philosophical awareness of for it to happen, but it's an important thing to keep in mind what actually counts as work towards social change. Because a lot of what he doesn't agree with in terms of political philosophy and the way that people who say they want social change are behaving is not about doing things as such, but instead to set aside their responsibility and play a defensive game of not becoming complicit in politics and policy that they oppose. And so, for example, somebody will be so worried that they might be perceived as being racist that they will, instead of doing anything to make a difference in the lives of people of a different race, will defer their responsibility, their social responsibility that we take care of each other to listening, quote unquote, to what people of another race have to say. And so listening comes at absolutely no cost to the listener. And the person who is listening has all the power and privilege in the relationship and yet doesn't wield any of that to do anything other than give a stage to the people who have none of their privilege. And so there's no actual justice happening. The only thing that's happening is that the elite person who's in a position to create change is covering their reputation with socially acceptable behavior. And so, like, a more concrete example that he gives in the book is the water crisis that happened in Flint, Michigan, where there was lead pipes that were poisoning the community, and having the idea of people who are responsible for fixing that situation simply saying to the residents, well, tell me about your lead poisoning. Tell me what you would do in my position. What is it that you would want to have happen? Which is not helpful, obviously. Like, you want some actual action to be taken, and it's not even necessary to have to ask questions like this, especially because it's the formal responsibility of the leaders of the city to take care of these kind of problems. So they don't need to hold a meeting about what the people who are suffering from poisoning would like to say about their experience. Instead, action needs to be taken to protect people who are vulnerable. He goes on to point out that traumatized people are not the best advocates for themselves necessarily. Sometimes the best that traumatized people can achieve is survival or to get into a position where healing can start to occur, and not to make sweeping structural social change necessarily. So I say that the book is a formal academic structure. So what I mean by that is that the beginning of the book lays out the entire structure of the rest of the book, tells you exactly what to expect, what the goals of the book are, how the goals will be achieved, what Táíwò is laying out, and then the kind of conclusion that he will lead you into, which is not really laid out at the beginning because you need to assimilate all of the information as you go along in order to arrive at the conclusion. This is like very typical of modern philosophical academic text. And then that's immediately followed by defining his terms and giving a genealogy of the relevant concepts. And so he gives us a definition of elite capture and identity politics. Identity politics are relevant because it is as a term, a creation of the Black community and the Black women community, especially, to distinguish special political action that might be necessary that are closely associated with being women, with being Black, and so on. But then beyond just being a term, it became a valuable kind of fulcrum politically that could be leveraged either by the right or the left to motivate voters. And so on the right, you would have, these people only care about identity politics. They don't care about qualifications. And then on the left, the assumption that people are going to vote based on their social class, racial class, and things like that. And so you would, get out the Black vote for the left merely because they are Black and they are the left. But in neither case is there an interest in changing the status quo, because the status quo of utilizing identity politics serves both sides quite well. They can both do effective fundraising around it and motivate voters to vote for their party. And so, merely by creating language that starts to distinguish what the various particular problems are for a group of people based on their gender and the color of their skin and all of the historical inequities that are built up around it, it doesn't really matter because there is no formal organization that's doing anything about it. And so it's not an effective strategy for creating change. While it has value in affecting perception and creating language with which we can create schema to imagine change, it has in fact become a tool of maintaining the status quo, or even for punishing the identified groups. And so in evaluating the outcome, you can see that actually it was not a very good strategy to employ at all. And then he goes on to talk about deference politics, which is directly related to this idea of identity politics. And so deference politics is exactly what I was already talking about, where you defer your responsibility as a privileged person to lift up the voice of an oppressed person or vulnerable person, and thereby shift the responsibility from the privileged to the traumatized. And this is not a very effective strategy for disrupting the status quo either. And so he talks about, instead of worrying about, who's in the room, we should be thinking about building new kinds of rooms. And so he could say, from his position as a guy who grew up as Nigerian immigrant who's an American citizen, and then going through the educational system to become a formal academic and being widely published and a public persona, he understands who the people that are in the room, who they are allowed to be. And when they talk about deferring, they can't even imagine the kind of people who need to be deferred to if that were actually the real case, let alone any of the people who are actually in the room, because there's a structural filter within academia that limits who can even have a voice or who can be effectively heard by these people who have the privilege to create a stage for people to have a perspective at all. And a lot of effort and time is spent in the book talking about structural conditions that have more to do when it comes to political philosophy than particular personal perspectives, the way that these things are often framed to us in the popular public. And so you'll be told, like, when you're voting or whatever, that you should think about, who has your interests, who would deliver the kind of outcomes that you would like to see happen, and you should vote for those people. And that you should try to be a good person, and that your political philosophy should be aligned with a moral outlook and should be ethical in its deployment, and all of these kind of things that have to do with like your own personal feelings and how they relate to political realities and the use of power. But a lot of those sensibilities are being gamified by a structural system that you were born into and had no agency in setting up the terms of, and that you have no power to, or a very limited amount of power to affect. And so he uses the example, the fable, the legend of the emperor with no clothes, and talks about how those people are not telling the emperor that he has very fine clothes because that's what they actually believe or what they think is the ethically nice thing to do to a self-deluded emperor or any of these kind of niceties. It's about the structure of power and about the understanding that if they tell the truth to this dangerous and powerful person, that they could be punished, and that all of them need to collectively go along with it. And that in the legend, there's just a child who speaks the truth because they don't understand the dynamics of power. And these are the kinds of structural forces that are funneling people into the spaces where they can be, quote unquote, in the room. And so we need to change those structures and, quote unquote, build new rooms. And he talks about how all of these social structures can be thought of in terms of games or game theory, because in games, you're not necessarily operating according to the formal morality and ethics that you carry around in your conscience. Instead, you're thinking about advantages, disadvantages, how to win, how to gain rewards, and how to avoid punishments. And so if we use that kind of strategic thinking along with a commitment to action rather than deferral or trying to avoid complicity, then those are the ways to build the constructive politics that he is outlining in the book. The danger always is of elite capture, which the book is named after. And this is the idea that just like identity politics was captured, that any kind of philosophical deployment can be enfolded by people who already have social advantages and have, in terms of game theory, every reason to protect their position within the society. And so they want to perpetuate the power and privilege that they have. And so they're not going to just give it up out of a sense of moral duty or something. Even if they might be sympathetic to widespread social change, the entire structure of society would require a much bigger sacrifice on the elite's part than on anybody else for that change to occur. And so it's just unlikely in terms of the game theory. Once again, you're going to have the basketball star say, we need to stop playing basketball and we need to start playing baseball around here. And that's not really in the basketball star's best interest, right? So it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. That's my own really bad example and not his. So don't hold it against the book. But you kind of get what I'm saying, that he's saying we need to change the game, but we can't rely on elites to make that happen. And that the elites are going to, whether they are good people or not, it doesn't really matter, experience very strong pressure from the system itself to maintain the system. And so they cannot be relied upon and must be considered enemies to change. And so the danger of any kind of constructive politics is always that the elite could capture such a thing. And so there needs to be a vigilance around that happening. And that's kind of why a lot of the things that he talks about in the book, I say, will become less relevant over time because the particular examples might be fixed or can become things that just fall out of favor with the elite. But this dynamic between a need for social change and a resistance and an inertia of the elite to continue their own privilege is something that is going to stay until there's a massive amount of pressure to change it. And Táíwò basically believes that the key to changing things has to be a more action-oriented focus of political philosophy rather than a kind of formalist or language-based. As important as language-based and formalism is, that can't be the foundation for change. And there needs to be a divestment of emotional enjoyment and identity from ideas of like complicity and us versus them in politics. A focus on outcomes rather than process, in other words. So you need to worry less about not getting messy while you're fixing the problems than actually, like focusing on the outcome and having the problem fixed. America is in the midst of tumultuous political polarization and an all-around dumbing down of political discourse. And so I think ideas like this are important, that the wielding of power in politics is about action and not about stance. And while it can feel very good to do things the quote unquote right way, it's far more important that they get done. Because while we stand by and talk about them, the other side can be out there locking people up and shooting them. And once those kinds of things happen, and, once people are starving, once they're locked out of the system, once they're deported, then political change is over. There is nothing there to change because our politics are the people. And so the people need to exist in order for the change to happen. And so this idea of constructive politics, I think, is as vital as it's ever been, even if all the particular terms around it are less relevant than they might have been when the book was published.